Edgerton High School Alternative Program, Option 2, Civics. Chapter 18, Freedom of Speech and Press. Learning objectives, the students will be able to name the historic case of freedom of the press, explain why freedom of speech and freedom of the press are important, and describe the protections and limits of freedom of speech. Also, describe the protections and limits of freedom of the press. Words to know: criticize, to point out what is wrong with something. Express, to say or show what you think or feel. Information, facts, knowledge given or received. Slander, to say something untrue about someone in order to do harm to that person. Prior restraint, in order to prevent a person from doing something. Libel, to write or broadcast something untrue about someone in order to harm that person. Obscene, something offends the public sense of decency. And protest, to disagree strongly. Historic case of freedom of the press. 1734, American colonies were still under British rule. A newspaper called the New York Weekly Journal printed stories criticizing the local British government. Publisher John Peter Zenger was arrested and thrown in jail for writing those stories. At trial, Zenger tried to prove stories were true. The judge would not allow him to do so. Any stories criticizing the government, true or not, were against the law. A jury of local people went against the judge, set Zenger free because they were convinced he had printed the truth. The jury believed people had the right to speak the truth. The jury also believed that people had the right to criticize their government. Today, the First Amendment promises freedom of the press and freedom of speech to all Americans. Why freedom of speech and freedom of the press are important. The United States is a representative democracy. In a representative democracy, the people of the country hold the final power. The people choose representatives, and representatives pass laws that the people want. The people must have new ideas to help govern the country, and freedom of speech and press are necessary to do this effectively. Freedom of speech and the press allow people to express most ideas in public. They do not have to fear being stopped by the government. This helps people get good information, and people need facts and ideas before deciding what to do. A free press helps bring out facts, both good and bad, brings out many different ideas, both good and bad. People who agree with the government usually do not need protection, and people whose ideas are unpopular need their freedom of speech and press protected most. Sometimes good ideas are not popular at first. In the 1760s, very few people wanted the American colonies to separate from Great Britain. By 1776, that unpopular idea had grown into a war for independence. When the Constitution was written, the idea of freeing slaves was unpopular in several states. The idea of allowing minority groups and women the right to vote was unpopular. Later, these ideas became part of the Constitution. None of these ideas would have been heard without freedom of speech or the press. Freedom of speech. Protections. You can speak freely without being arrested or stopped. You can say what you believe is true, even if you are wrong. You can talk about your ideas, even if they are unpopular. You can criticize the government and its leaders. Freedom of speech covers more than just speaking. You may write, make signs or pictures, join in a march, wave a flag, and you are free to make your ideas public. You can talk on the radio, on television, on the internet, or in public places. You can speak in parks, on street corners, and in indoor or outdoor arenas. You cannot use free speech to break the law. These are freedom of speech limits. You cannot slander other people by saying things you know are not true. You cannot say things you know are not true if they put others in danger, like crying fire in a crowded room when there really is no fire. One limit the Supreme Court has not put on free speech is that of prior restraint. Your right to speak cannot be taken away for something the government thinks you are going to say. You cannot be persecuted for unspoken ideas or speech. Freedom of the press. Protections. It protects newspapers, magazines, radio and television stations. Protects writers, artists, and those who make films. Limits. Newspapers and or other press organizations face the same limits as other Americans. They cannot libel, slandering someone in print, on purpose. Freedom of speech is limited by laws against slander, speaking untruth to harm someone. Limits regarding national security. You cannot hurt the defense of the country. There are limits on printing or publishing obscene materials. Courts have used community standards to determine what is considered obscene. In 1965, the United States was fighting the Vietnam War. Here are some landmark changes in that law. Many people in the United States had strong disagreements about the war. In December 1965 in Des Moines, Iowa, 3 students decided to protest the war. Mary Bether Tinker, her brother John and Christopher Eckhart, intended to wear black armbands to show they were against the war. They would carry no signs and make no speeches, only wear the armbands. School officials found out about the plan and believed school was no place for protest. They decided to send home any students who wore armbands. The 3 students came to school wearing armbands and were sent home. The students' parents thought that was unfair and took the school to court. The case went to the Supreme Court, where they needed to decide whether students had the same rights as adults under the First Amendment. Schools usually have the right to make their own rules about how students behave at school. School usually has the right to stop any trouble from happening in class. But did they have the right to stop it before it happened? Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Tinkers in Tinker v. Des Moines Independent Community School District, 1969. Said that the students were protected by the First Amendment, even at school. They ruled that although the armbands may create a chance of trouble, the chance of trouble was not a good enough reason to take away the freedom of speech. In review, the freedom of press had its beginnings in colonial America in 1734. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press are important to Americans for many reasons. People need to express ideas freely if they are to take part in government. The First Amendment guarantees certain protections in the area of free speech. The Supreme Court has placed certain limits on free speech. Freedom of the press protects newspapers, magazines, radio, and television stations. It also protects writers, artists, and filmmakers. There are limits on freedom of the press. Here is your quiz. Good luck, and see you in class.